Well, for more now on the debate on affirmative action, joining us from Boston is Swan Lee. She's the co-founder of the Asian American Coalition for Education, a group that joined the complaint against Harvard University. Here in the studio is Janelle Wong. She is a professor and director of the Asian American Studies program at the University of Maryland. From Philadelphia, we're joined by Stacy Hawkins. She's an associate professor of law at Rutgers University. And Neal McCluskey is the director of the Center for Educational Freedom at the Cato Institute right here in Washington, D.C. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Let's start with that lawsuit against Harvard University. Swan Lee, your group, the Asian American Coalition, filed that lawsuit together with other organizations. What is the core of your complaint?
It's an administrative complaint to the Department of Justice. The core of the complaint is based on a lot of research by scholars. Asian American students have to consistently score a lot more ACT points than other students to get the same chance for higher education. And we're talking about points, not because that's the only thing they're good at, but because that's the only thing we have objective standards for. That's the objective data we have. And it is much, much harder to prove subjective discrimination when they receive it.
So is it the case then that many Asian American students are not getting into universities because a higher standard is applied to them?
Absolutely.
Right. Harvard University says the majority of its incoming students is non-white, and that's for the second year running. Just over 50% are from minority groups including African Americans, Asian Americans, and Hispanics. What do you make of that?
Harvard's viewpoint on that is very superficial and shallow. When we talk about diversity, we're not just talking about the pigment diversity, just the race of people. We're talking about deeper issues like socioeconomic issues, assimilation levels. When you want to get students from truly diverse backgrounds, you have to consider the socioeconomic backgrounds of these students. You don't just take students from very assimilated backgrounds, like a high upper class, and just make them fit the racial category. You need to take students that are very talented and very driven, motivated, and from diverse, lower income, working class backgrounds. And that's the thing that Harvard is not paying attention, not addressing.
Janelle, Harvard is, of course, a private institution. We have here a statement from the spokesman for Harvard, Rachel Dane. This is what she said. She said, Harvard's admissions process considers each applicant as a whole person, and we review many factors consistent with the legal standards established by the U.S. Supreme Court. Firstly, do you buy that? And what is your view of the standards applied by Harvard?
I do buy that. I think that, it's a misunderstanding, I think, among some Asian Americans that race is a primary determinant of any holistic admissions process. Harvard University uses holistic admissions. That means that race is one of many, 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 many factors that is considered, and it's certainly not the primary one, and they certainly do not employ quotas, which have been ruled illegal since the 1970s. And so I think they are complying. I do buy that statement. I have a teenage son, and he's about to apply to college, and he is off the charts on standardized admissions test scores, right? And I think that's wonderful, but I don't think that's a measure of his qualification. It is one indicator, and it's an indicator that he has two very highly educated parents, both have PhDs, that he lives in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Maryland, and that he will attend a high school that is one of the top-rated high schools in the country. And we know that standardized tests are actually very, very highly correlated with these measures of socioeconomic status. Would we ever, I agree with Swan Lee that we should look at socioeconomic status, and we should know that test scores are actually a very good measure of socioeconomic advantage.
Okay, let me bring in Stacy Hawkins on this. Stacy, we have centuries of discrimination that have placed minority groups at a distinct disadvantage when it comes to admissions to institutions of higher learning. Does affirmative action level that playing field? Does it make it fairer, give everyone an equal chance?
Well, one of the things that I always like to point out about this debate is that the current race-conscious admissions programs that are being employed by most selective colleges and universities today are not the same affirmative action that was being employed back in the 60s that were designed to remedy past discrimination. In fact, in 1978, the Supreme Court, in a case involving the University of California, expressly said that using race to determine whom to admit to college and universities in order to remedy societal discrimination is unconstitutional. And at that point, colleges and universities really shifted the justification for considering race in admissions away from the notion that this is designed, like past affirmative action programs, to remedy discrimination. And instead, it's really about trying to achieve the educational and the pedagogical missions of colleges and universities, which is to prepare students for the 21st century, both for the workforce and, in the case of public institutions in particular, to be leaders in our democracy, and ensuring that their student bodies are sufficiently diverse to take on those challenges is one of the key criteria to complete that educational mission. So I do think that part of the reason why race has to be considered is that among applicant pools, we know that we continue to have disparities in educational opportunities, particularly in public education, that Black and Hispanic students overwhelmingly go to under-resourced, racially isolated public schools where they are not getting the same preparation for college and university that white and Asian students get. And so they are less well represented in those applicant pools. They don't always have the same credentials, but when they do, there are fewer of them, and that is the reason why these colleges and universities are very deliberate about, if we want diversity, we have to be mindful that there are some population of students that are underrepresented in our applicant pools because of these educational disparities. And that is what these diversity admissions programs is designed to take account of.
Right, Stacy, let me ask you this. When we look at these criteria for admission, all these different criteria, race is only one component. Are you saying that race should be, we should attach a bit more importance to race, weight it a bit heavier?
So that's exactly what I'm saying, and that's exactly what happened. So again, in determining whom to admit, colleges and universities consider a number of factors. I think one of the common misconceptions in this debate is that college admissions are determined exclusively on the basis of academic credentials. That simply has never been true. College admissions decisions have always been made on the basis of a constellation of factors. Just one kind of counterfactual to that narrative that it's all about your academic credentials are legacy admissions. We know that colleges and universities have traditionally admitted students on the basis of legacy considerations, right, notwithstanding their academic credentials. So it always has been the case that universities consider a constellation of factors. Today, the court and colleges acknowledge that having and amassing a diverse student body is critically important to their educational missions. And so the ability to contribute to that diversity is one of the considerations, and there are lots of ways. Right. And I agree with Ms. Lee that socioeconomic status is one of the ways, race and ethnicity is one of the ways, gender is one of the ways, geography, all kinds of considerations factor into who can contribute to student body diversity. But race is critically important, particularly because certain students are grossly underrepresented in the applicant pools.
Okay, Neal, what is your opinion on the use of affirmative action at public institutions?
Sure, so we got two problems here, and I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is this is a very difficult problem, and I don't know that there's any one fully just solution. And it does go back to our history of just disgraceful discrimination for centuries against African Americans. And though the Supreme Court has changed what it says your criteria can be as a school, I think schools often rightly are saying part of this holistic assessment is certainly race. You mentioned the word weighted. They're not supposed to be officially weighted, but surely that's part of it. And for a private institution, that's great. I actually think they should do that, because the private institution isn't the government. We don't have a claim on a private institution to say, you must be colorblind, you must treat everyone equally. It becomes a very difficult situation if you talk about a public college, which is a government college, because what we're really saying is, in order to remedy what was clearly a centuries of discrimination based on race, we now have to use race to make up for that. And clearly there are some groups that doesn't benefit. And it can become especially concerning if you think of Asian Americans, because they probably weren't the group that was responsible for most of the terrible things that happened in the past. That said, there is no such thing as the monolithic white person or Asian person or African American person, and that also makes this a very complicated issue.
Okay, Janelle?
Let me just jump in here. We keep hearing the term discrimination, and yes, it's interesting that Asian Americans are bringing this suit because it usually has been an issue where there has been a white plaintiff. Do I believe that Asian Americans face discrimination? Yes, in many areas of life, Asian Americans face discrimination in promotions, in corporate leadership. But in higher education, we have not seen convincing evidence that Asian Americans face discrimination. The studies that folks mention in terms of there's a study that shows that Asian Americans must score a certain amount of points over other groups to get in. That is not the right conclusion to draw. You simply cannot draw that conclusion.
Is that the so-called Asian tax?
Yes, that is Espen Shade's Princeton study. And if you look at the actual paper, the actual study, there's not enough data to actually conclude that Asian Americans need a specific number of points over any other group. But let me go back to this discrimination point. Yes, Asian Americans face discrimination. I do not think that there's convincing evidence that they face it in higher education. Let's look at a public university, to go to Neal's point, UC Berkeley. UC Berkeley is in California. California has a Chinese population of about 4%. And 20% of UC Berkeley students are Chinese. California's population is 6% black. 3% of UC Berkeley's student population is black. Which group is advantaged there and which group is disadvantaged? And if Asian Americans think they're disadvantaged vis-a-vis blacks and Latinos, then I'd like to see them apply for a job, try to get a mortgage, encounter a police person in the public sphere as a black person versus an Asian American.
Okay, let me get Swan Lee's view on this. Swan Lee, as Janelle says, she's not convinced that there is excessive discrimination against Asian Americans when it comes to being admitted to colleges and universities. What do you think?
I think that means the scholars are out of touch with reality. When you look at California, who doesn't practice affirmative action anymore, they still have a lot of diversity in the true sense. No way is diversity sacrificed after they abandon affirmative action. So when Harvard and other people who push affirmative action keep saying, oh, we have to consider race for diversity, they're not admitting that race is not the only way you can use to achieve diversity. When California abandoned it, they still achieve a lot of diversity. Nothing bad happened in California. And even in private colleges like Vassar College, after they focused on class, they achieved a lot of diversity. So why do people hold on to the racial consideration if it's not benefiting them in some way and not sacrificing other people in some other way? Why don't we just abandon racial consideration, give everybody a fair chance? Why are people holding on to that? You know, when affirmative action was established in the 1960s, that was a time it was necessary because that was the time when the racial segregation was coming to an end, and the communities are very segregated. They have separate schools. They have different teachers, different quality of teachers. But half a century later, with all the things that the government and everybody have been helped, we don't have that kind of drastic differences between communities anymore. Even within the race, we have a lot of different income levels, assimilation levels.
Right.
People are very mixed, like each other. So why do we consider them like in a very segregated way, like just
schools are actually
a member
more
of a race,
segregated.
not just treat them as an individual.
Schools
why do
are
we have
actually
to look
more
at them as a member of a racial group? And that's not a human approach.
But schools are actually more segregated today, more racially segregated today than in the 1960s.
That is out of touch because why I think it's out of touch because everybody who tell me we need racial consideration is not African American. I have heard a lot of Asian Americans, Caucasian Americans tell me, oh, it's absolutely necessary to consider race. But I've never heard any African American person who tells me he actually benefits from racial-based affirmative action and he wanted to stay here. I've never heard that. So on my way here, I talked to my taxi driver who is African American dad. He has a daughter in college right now in Massachusetts. Yeah. And I asked him, what do you think of affirmative action? Should we keep it? He said it's not good.
Public opinion surveys.
He feels bad that people are not getting a fair chance.
Janelle,
It makes him feel bad. He thinks it's not good.
All right, I'll
He
get to you in a
thinks it
moment.
should be
I just want to
differently.
bring, Stacy, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, so I just want to reiterate that this is not affirmative action as we knew it in the 60s. This is not about remedying past discrimination. This is not about reaching back into history and in 2017 trying to remedy the discrimination, societal or otherwise, that occurred. The Supreme Court has clearly said colleges and universities cannot be engaged in that kind of race-conscious admissions. And instead, it's about trying to achieve diversity, which everybody almost universally concedes is a significant educational and pedagogical interest for colleges and universities. The question is, how do we achieve diversity? If we all agree that it's important, we need to make sure that colleges and universities are sufficiently diverse. Why? Because our students can't learn how to be culturally competent and enter the world with the skills that they're going to need in the 21st century if they are not interacting with people who have different experiences from them, who have different perspectives, who can bring something different to bear in the kind of academic enterprise.
Stacey,
And
what do you
so we
make-
know that
Most
diversity is
people are
important.
getting that.
Okay,
But they don't
Swan
consider
Lee, I'll
race, but
get to you in-
consider income levels.
All right, I'll
They
get to you in a
actually
moment.
are getting that experience.
I just have a
So
question
it's not
for
true that they're not getting
Okay,
it.
I have a question for Stacy. What do you make of the court case in Texas, University of Texas, where a white student complained that she was rejected because of her race, and the court ruled in her favor? Well, it didn't rule in her favor. It said that the universities can still continue to use race as a criteria.
What case is that?
That's the case of Abigail Fisher at the University of Texas.
Abigail Fisher lost her case. She lost it at the district court, she lost it at the Fifth Circuit, and she lost it at the Supreme Court. Abigail Fisher lost, and the University of Texas, a race-conscious admissions program has been upheld repeatedly. And in fact, to Ms. Lee's point, you know, again, the University of Texas has a population of Asian students that is 3 times as large as the population of Asian high school graduates in the state of Texas. I don't think that that's evidence that Asian Americans are suffering any discrimination in admissions. They have 3 times as many students at the University of Texas as they
We're talking about
matriculate
Harvard, not University
out
of
of high
Texas,
school.
I'm sorry.
It
Neal?
is the
We're talking
only
about Harvard.
population that is so overrepresented. Blacks and Hispanics, however, have a much lower. Blacks have 60% fewer students at the University of Texas than they matriculate through high school. Hispanics have 50% fewer students. Asian Americans have 300% more students at the University of Texas than they matriculate through high school in Texas.
Okay.
That does not evidence
Texas uses a
discrimination.
All right,
different
one moment.
approach from
One moment.
Harvard
Neal, go ahead.
University.
Yeah, I just think it's important
uses a
that a
different
bit
approach
to
from
talk
Harvard.
about a big part of this problem is, first of all, how colleges admit kids is something that we actually don't know about. It all kind of happens behind closed doors. And so we talk about that the goal now is diversity because that's what the courts required, and certainly they did, and that may be what every admissions officer is talking about. But it may also be that some are saying, look, we do have to have make up for past discrimination, or we may need to make sure that we keep these proportions. We don't say it, but there's nobody back there when they're making those decisions. And so I think a lot of people go to college, and even if they're being told this is just about getting a diverse group, they don't know for sure that's the case. And the other big problem is this becomes sort of a zero-sum game where somebody says, if this student is admitted, I can't get a place. And as long as we have that, and we don't know what's going on in the admissions departments, really know what's going on, we know what we're told, there's always going to be this sort of concern and even sort of animosity toward the process.
Okay,
Right,
Janelle?
thank you for pointing it out. The Harvard
Swan Lee,
University
one moment. I'll
is
get
black
to you in a
box.
moment. Janelle, go ahead.
So just on 2 points. One is whether there's support for affirmative action and race-conscious admissions among African Americans, to Ms. Lee's point. Yes, public opinion surveys show that African Americans have the highest rates of support for race-conscious admissions policies, and that most Asian Americans also support race-conscious admissions policies. On the second issue, the black box that Neal raises, what do we know about college admissions? If you actually look at the holistic admissions process, you can find out information about how that is. Most universities do publish the factors that they use to consider applicants.
There's some
And
organizations.
you know that it's not proportional because I just cited the statistics that say that Asian Americans are overrepresented by 300% at the University of Texas, where African Americans and Hispanics are underrepresented by 50 and 60% respectively. So it's clearly not proportional admissions.
What about the view of the American Civil Liberties Union, which has equated this with civil rights? They basically say that if there's a shift in policy, it would mark basically an alarming shift in a direction that threatens all these basically progress that's been made for civil rights. Go ahead.
So, you know, I think there is a civil rights issue at the heart of these cases, and that is, are we providing equal access to colleges and universities across racial groups? And clearly, as we have heard here, the statistics show we are not doing that. And we need to do better. Not just, this is just one part of the process, right? College admissions, but in our K through 12 system as well, there's something terribly wrong, and that is a civil rights issue. Do students have an equal chance, regardless of race, to thrive?
Swan Lee, there was a Gallup poll that was done in 2016 which showed that nearly 7 in 10 Americans believe a prospective student's race should not play a role in college admission. What is the ultimate goal then? What criteria should be used?
We should adopt an income-based approach. You know, we consider the socioeconomic issues. That will be more fair to everybody, because right now, I think the Harvard University and some scholars, they consider Asian American students an enemy to diversity. Whenever Asian American students raise a complaint about being discriminated against, they say, oh, we are trying to achieve diversity. But why are you excluding Asian American students from the notion of diversity? They are part of diversity. They are minority, and they have been on the receiving end of discrimination for the last 150 years. And there has never been any structural approach from the system to help them to have that wrong corrected. They're not getting any help. The lower income students of Asian American community and European American, they're not getting any help. And just imagine how hard that is. When you have somebody in a Chinatown working as a dishwasher, his kid is trying to go to college, but he's not getting any help from the system. Is that fair? How can people think that's fair?
Okay.
How can people think that's not discrimination? That's
right,
unbelievable.
Janelle, very quickly.
Asian Americans actually do benefit from government programs, and they actually have benefited from affirmative action. That's how they got into higher education to begin with.
All right, Stacy, I've just got a minute left. How does one get race?
Not a fair chance. They go to community colleges.
Okay, one moment, Swan Lee.
Then
Stacy,
they cannot pay the tuition.
Right, Stacy, how do we get race out of admissions policies? You know, we had a situation 100 years ago when Jewish students were targeted at Harvard. Harvard's leadership at that time believed that there were too many Jewish students. The president at that time at Harvard University said that that would ultimately lead to what he said was the college being ruined.
Well, I wish I had the answer. I think that that's the million-dollar question, and we haven't figured it out. And greater minds than mine have been put to this effort. And what we know so far is that all of the race-neutral efforts that have been tried have been inadequate in trying to create the kinds of diversity among student bodies that colleges and universities know they need in order to effectively serve their educational and pedagogical missions. So whether it's socioeconomic diversity, which we know even Richard Kallenberg at the Century Foundation, who's the biggest proponent of socioeconomic considerations, acknowledges that they're not adequate to achieve the kinds of racial and ethnic diversity we know we also want.
Okay.
We've looked at whether or not you can eliminate, legacy admissions. Those don't fully account for it. So I think that we're still far from the point where we can say we can eliminate them, but everyone's working on trying to find that solution.
Okay, that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.